In the darkness of her bedroom, Grace Fryer's jaw began to glow with a ghostly green light, and she knew with absolute certainty that the miracle substance she'd painted onto watch dials for 5 years was now painting her bones with death. The year was 1922, and Grace was 24 years old, lying in her parents' house in Orange, New Jersey, experiencing something that no medical textbook could explain. When she turned off the lamp beside her bed, her jawbone emitted a faint luminescence, visible in the mirror across the room. It was beautiful in a terrible way, like watching your own ghost emerge from within your living flesh. But to understand how Grace Fryer came to glow in the dark, we need to go back 5 years earlier to 1917, when the world was at war and radium was considered one of the most miraculous substances ever discovered. Before we continue, if you'd like to join me for more stories like this, feel free to subscribe. I share a new one every day. And if you don't mind, leave a comment and tell me where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. I love seeing how far these stories travel. The United States Radium Corporation factory in Orange, New Jersey, was an unassuming brick building that sat among other industrial facilities, distinguished only by the bright sign above its entrance and the steady stream of young women who arrived each morning for work. These women, mostly teenagers and young adults, were considered fortunate to have secured positions at the factory. The work was clean, the pay was good, and the substance they worked with was the height of modern science and glamour. Radium had been discovered by Marie and Pierre Curie in 1898, isolated from tons of pitchblende in a process that won them the Nobel Prize. The element glowed with its own light, required no external power source, and seemed to embody the promise of the new century. It was revolutionary, magical, a substance that appeared to defy the normal rules of matter by producing endless energy from within itself. By the time World War I began, radium had captured the public imagination completely. It was added to consumer products with abandon. Radium water for health, radium face creams for beauty, radium suppositories for vigor. Wealthy men carried radium-laced water in flasks. Society women applied radium makeup to achieve a luminous complexion. The substance was expensive, more valuable than gold, which only added to its mystique and prestige. And radium paint, mixed with zinc sulfide to create a luminescent compound, was perfect for watch dials. Soldiers needed to read their watches in the darkness of trenches. The military needed instruments with dials that glowed without requiring electricity. The U.S. Radium Corporation had secured government contracts to produce these luminous timepieces, and they needed workers skilled enough to paint tiny numbers and hands with absolute precision. Enter the dial painters, young women with steady hands, good eyesight, and the patience required for detailed work. They were recruited from the local communities around Orange and neighboring towns. The job advertisements made it sound glamorous and patriotic. Help the war effort, work with cutting-edge science, earn good money doing skilled labor. Grace Fryer was one of the first to be hired in 1917 when she was just 19 years old. She'd graduated from high school with good marks, had worked briefly in a bank, but found that work tedious and the pay inadequate. When her friend mentioned the dial painting position at U.S. Radium, Grace jumped at the opportunity. The factory studio where the dial painters worked was on the top floor, designed to maximize natural light. It was a large open room with rows of workbenches, each station equipped with a small dish of radium paint, fine camel hair brushes, and trays of watch dials or instrument panels waiting to be painted. The room was filled with young women, perhaps 70 or 80 at the height of production, all bent over their work with the intense concentration of artists. Grace's first day, she was trained by an older dial painter, a woman of perhaps 25 who seemed impossibly sophisticated and worldly. The technique was simple but required practice to master. You dipped your brush in the radium paint, twirled it between your lips to bring the bristles to a fine point, then carefully painted the numbers or hands on the dial. Lip, dip, paint. Lip, dip, paint. The rhythm became automatic after a while. "Won't the paint hurt us?" Grace asked during that first training session, watching her instructor put the brush to her lips. The woman laughed. "Hurt us? Honey, this stuff is good for you. Haven't you heard? Radium is in all the health tonics, makes your skin glow, gives you energy. The scientists say it's perfectly safe. Some of the girls even paint it on their teeth and fingernails for fun, make themselves glow when they go dancing. And it was true. The company assured them repeatedly that radium was not only safe but beneficial. Scientists came to the factory and gave talks about radium's healthful properties. The company president himself demonstrated by painting radium on his own hands. The girls were told that the tiny amounts they might ingest from lip-pointing their brushes were negligible, perhaps even good for them, like the radium water that wealthy people paid premium prices to drink. So Grace learned the technique and settled into the work. It was meticulous and somewhat tedious, but it paid 3 times what she could make in a department store, and there was something satisfying about the precision required, the transformation of a plain dial into something that would glow with useful light. The dial painting studio developed its own culture, its own social world. The women, most between 15 and 25 years old, chatted as they worked, sharing gossip and jokes, talking about their families and their dreams. They called themselves the Ghost Girls because by the end of each shift, they were covered in radium dust. It settled on their clothes, their skin, their hair. In dim light, they glowed softly, like spirits made visible. Some of the girls embraced this ghostly quality with youthful exuberance. They painted radium on their fingernails to make them shine at the cinema. They brushed it on their teeth to make their smiles glow at dance halls, delighting young men with their luminous grins. They painted their dresses with elaborate designs that would reveal themselves in darkness. It was magic, they thought. They were working with bottled starlight, with the essence of modern science, with something that made them special and glamorous. Grace was more modest in her use of the paint, but she understood the appeal. There was something intoxicating about the glow, about the way the mundane was transformed into something extraordinary. After work, walking home in the evening, she could see the faint luminescence of her own hands, could watch the footprints she left behind glowing briefly on the pavement before fading. It made her feel like a character in a fairy tale, touched by something magical. The work was demanding. Each dial painter was expected to complete approximately 250 dials per day, which meant painting at least 250 times the numbers in hands, sometimes more for complex instrument panels. The payment was piece rate, so speed was incentive. The faster you worked, the more you earned, and the fastest way to work was to keep that brush point sharp, which meant lip pointing constantly. How much radium did they ingest this way? Later, scientists would calculate it. Each time a dial painter touched the brush to her lips, she ingested a small amount of radium paint, perhaps a fraction of a milligram per brush stroke. But multiply that by 250 dials per day, by 6 days per week, by months and years of work, and the amount became significant, deadly significant. But in 1917, 1918, 1919, no one knew this. The girls painted their dials, earned their pay, lived their lives. They dated young men and went to movies. They saved money for hope chests and wedding dresses. They bought Liberty bonds to support the war effort. They felt patriotic and modern and fortunate to be part of something important. Grace Fryer worked at U.S. Radium for 5 years, from 1917 to 1922. In that time, she painted thousands upon thousands of watch dials, touched her brush to her lips perhaps hundreds of thousands of times. The radium she ingested settled in her bones, replacing calcium in her skeletal structure, emitting radiation from within her body, slowly and invisibly destroying her from the inside out. By 1922, Grace began to feel unwell. Nothing dramatic at first, just persistent fatigue that didn't improve with rest. Her joints ached, particularly in her legs and back. She attributed this to long hours at the workbench, to the natural stiffness that comes from sitting in one position for extended periods. Then her teeth began to trouble her. One became loose, then another. She went to a dentist who examined her and seemed puzzled. Her gums were deteriorating, he said, but he couldn't identify the cause. He extracted the loose teeth, but instead of healing, the extraction sites became infected. The infections wouldn't respond to treatment, wouldn't heal no matter what medications were applied. More teeth loosened. The dentist extracted them as well, but the same pattern repeated. The wounds wouldn't heal. In fact, they seemed to grow worse, the bone of her jaw becoming exposed, necrotic. The pain was constant and severe. And then came the night when Grace turned off her lamp and saw herself glowing in the mirror. Her jaw, her bones, were luminous with the radium she'd ingested during all those years of lip-pointing brushes. She went to doctors, specialists, anyone who might be able to explain what was happening to her. Most were baffled. Some suggested it was rheumatism. Others thought perhaps syphilis, though Grace had led an entirely respectable life, and the suggestion was both medically incorrect and morally insulting. A few wondered if it might be something to do with her work at the radium factory. But the company had assured everyone that radium was safe, and who were these doctors to contradict the assurances of industrial scientists? Grace was not alone in her suffering. Other dial painters from US Radium were experiencing similar symptoms. Molly Magia had been one of the most skilled dial painters, fast and precise, able to complete her quota with time to spare. She'd worked at the factory since it opened, had painted more dials than perhaps anyone else. Molly's symptoms began in 1921. Tooth pain, then loose teeth, then a jaw that began to disintegrate. She went to dentist after dentist, endured extraction after extraction. The pain was excruciating. Her jaw was literally falling apart, the bone dying and crumbling, pieces of it coming away in doctors' hands. By 1922, Molly was bedridden, her entire lower jaw destroyed, a gaping wound in her face that wouldn't heal. The pain was so severe that she required constant morphine. She weighed barely 80 pounds. When she finally died in September 1922, at age 24, the death certificate listed the cause as ulcerative stomatitis, a condition where the mouth and jaw become ulcerated. But it was a grossly inadequate description of what radium poisoning had done to her body. Molly had a funeral, and among the mourners were many of her former co-workers from the dial painting studio. They stood by her grave and wondered, with increasing unease, if they might be next. Several of them had already begun experiencing symptoms: tooth pain, fatigue, aching bones. They compared notes in whispers, not wanting to seem dramatic or hysterical, but increasingly worried that something was very wrong. The US Radium Corporation was aware of these cases, though they did not publicize them. When dial painters came to the company complaining of illness, they were told that the problems were unrelated to their work, that radium was perfectly safe, that the girls must have contracted some other illness. The company sent them to company-selected doctors, who generally agreed that radium could not be the cause. What the dial painters did not know was that the dangers of radium had been known to scientists since at least 1901, when Pierre Curie deliberately exposed himself to radium and documented the resulting burns and injuries. They didn't know that the very scientists who worked for US Radium, who produced the radium paint and designed the production processes, took elaborate precautions in their own laboratories. They wore protective gear, used lead screens, handled radium with tongs and tools, never allowing it to touch their skin or enter their mouths. But the dial painters, the young women who actually worked with the substance day after day, were told it was safe and were instructed to lip point their brushes for efficiency. The company knew that asking workers to clean brushes between each use would slow production and reduce profits. The lip pointing technique was fast and cost-effective, and if there were health risks, well, those would take years to manifest and would be difficult to prove. This was corporate calculation at its most cynical, prioritizing profit over worker safety, while maintaining plausible deniability about the known hazards. By 1924, Grace Fryer was seriously ill. She'd left her job at US Radium 2 years earlier, when her health had begun to fail. Since then, she'd deteriorated steadily. Her jaw was badly damaged, several teeth gone, the bone itself becoming fragile and necrotic. Her back and legs were in constant pain. She walked with difficulty, her spine gradually compressing as the vertebrae weakened and fractured under the burden of simply supporting her body. She'd seen numerous doctors, spent what little savings she had on consultations and treatments that didn't help. Most doctors were honest enough to admit they didn't know what was wrong with her. A few were beginning to suspect that it might be related to her work with radium, but they had no proof, no established medical understanding of radium poisoning to guide diagnosis or treatment. Then Grace read a newspaper article that changed everything. A man named Dr. Harrison Martland, the chief medical examiner of Newark, had been conducting research into the deaths of dial painters. He'd examined Molly Maggia's body after her death, had studied her bones and tissues, and had developed a test that could detect radium in the human body. His findings were shocking. The dial painters had ingested massive amounts of radium. Their bones were saturated with it, and this internal radiation was destroying them from within. Dr. Martland called the condition radium necrosis, the death of tissue caused by radium radiation. He was willing to testify that the dial painters' illnesses were directly caused by their work at US Radium, that the company's assurances of safety were false, and that the women deserved compensation for what had been done to them. In Illinois, the Radium Dial Company employed another group of dial painters, and they too began to experience the same symptoms: tooth loss, jaw necrosis, bone pain, fatigue. These women, having heard about the New Jersey case, knew immediately what was wrong with them, and they decided to fight as well. The Illinois Radium Girls faced many of the same obstacles: difficulty finding lawyers, corporate delays and denials, the challenge of proving causation. But they had one advantage: precedent. The New Jersey case had established that radium could cause these injuries, that companies could be held liable. The legal path was clearer, even if still difficult. One of the Illinois dial painters, Catherine Wolfe Donahue, became a central figure in this second wave of litigation. She'd worked at Radium Dial in the 1920s, painting watch dials with the same lip-pointing technique. By the early 1930s, she was seriously ill, her bones deteriorating, her body failing. Catherine was married and had 2 young children. The thought of leaving them motherless, of dying without holding the company accountable, drove her to action. She filed suit against Radium Dial in 1936, along with several other former dial painters. The company's response was familiar: deny everything, delay the proceedings, wait for the plaintiffs to die. But Catherine was stubborn. Even as her condition worsened, even as she became bedridden and could barely speak, she pressed forward with the case. The trial was a horror show of corporate callousness. Company lawyers argued that Catherine's illness was unrelated to her work. They suggested she had syphilis, a cruel and baseless accusation. They subjected her to humiliating medical examinations designed to intimidate and exhaust her. But Catherine persisted. In one court appearance, so sick she had to be carried into the courtroom on a stretcher. She testified about working conditions at Radium Dial, about being told the paint was safe, about the lip-pointing technique that had poisoned her. Her testimony was powerful, devastating. Here was a dying woman, a mother, destroyed by corporate negligence and greed. The judge ruled in Catherine's favor in 1938, awarding her $5,660 in damages. It was a smaller amount than the New Jersey settlement, but it was another legal victory, another establishment of corporate liability. Catherine Wolfe Donahue died in 1938, shortly after the judgment at age 35. She'd lived long enough to win her case, to establish accountability, to ensure that her children would have some financial support after her death. The cases of the Radium Girls in New Jersey and Illinois and elsewhere fundamentally changed American labor law. They established the right of workers to sue for damages from workplace conditions. They created legal precedent for holding corporations accountable for knowing exposure of workers to hazardous materials. They contributed to the development of occupational health and safety regulations. The cases also changed scientific and medical understanding. Dr. Harrison Martland's work with the Radium Girls led to broader research into radiation poisoning, into how radioactive materials affected the human body, into what constitutes safe exposure levels. This research would become critically important later, during the development of nuclear weapons and nuclear power, when scientists needed to understand radiation risks. The testing methods Martland developed to detect radium in the body became standard medical tools. The concept of measuring radiation exposure and establishing safety limits grew directly from the work he did with the Radium Girls. In a very real sense, The suffering of these young women contributed to scientific knowledge that would eventually protect millions of other workers from radiation exposure. But focusing only on the legal and scientific legacy misses the human dimension of the story. These were real people, mostly very young women whose lives were destroyed by corporate negligence and greed. They deserve to be remembered not just as legal precedents or scientific case studies, but as individuals with dreams and families and futures that were stolen from them. Grace Fryer died in 1933 at age 35. She'd lived 5 years after the settlement, 5 years during which her body slowly broke down, during which the radium in her bones continued its work of destruction. She spent her final years largely bedridden, cared for by her parents, in constant pain despite the best medical care that the settlement money could buy. In those final years, she received letters from other dial painters, from women who'd been inspired by her courage to come forward with their own stories, to seek their own justice. She'd become a symbol, an advocate, though she'd never sought such a role. She just wanted to work, to earn a living, to live a normal life. Instead, she'd become a landmark in labor history. Catherine Schaub died in 1933 as well. Quinta MacDonald lived until 1929. Edna Hussman survived until 1931. Albina Larice lived the longest of the 5 original plaintiffs, dying in 1946. But those extra years were marked by continuous pain and disability. Molly Maggia, whose death had helped expose the radium poisoning, was buried in 1922 in a cemetery in New Jersey. In 2014, almost a century later, researchers exhumed her remains to study them. Her bones were still radioactive, still glowing faintly with the radium that had killed her so many decades earlier. The half-life of radium-226 is 1,600 years. Molly Maggia's skeleton will remain radioactive for millennia. The U.S. Radium Corporation continued to operate for decades after the Radium Girls cases, though under increasing regulation and scrutiny. The company eventually ceased dial painting operations, but the site of the factory in Orange, New Jersey, remained contaminated with radium. Cleanup efforts in the late 20th century found extensive contamination in the soil and groundwater around the facility. Even today, more than a century after the dial painters worked there, the site requires monitoring and containment. The radium they worked with, that they ingested, that the company disposed of carelessly, persists in the environment. The story of the Radium Girls reveals multiple layers of failure: scientific, corporate, regulatory, social. Scientists knew about radiation hazards but didn't adequately communicate those risks to workers. Corporations prioritized profit over worker safety and used their power to deny and obfuscate. Regulatory agencies didn't exist or didn't have authority to enforce workplace safety standards. Society undervalued the lives and health of young working-class women, but the story also reveals resilience, courage, and the power of ordinary people to challenge injustice. Grace Fryer, dying and in pain, spent 2 years searching for a lawyer, refusing to give up. Catherine Wolfe Donahue prosecuted her case from a stretcher, determined to win even though she knew the victory would come too late to save her. These women, and many others like them, fought for justice not just for themselves but for future workers they would never meet. Their legacy is embedded in the laws and regulations that now protect workers from hazardous materials. When workers have the right to know about workplace dangers, when companies must provide safety equipment and training, when exposure to toxic substances is monitored and limited, when workers can seek compensation for occupational injuries. All of these protections exist in part because of the Radium Girls. The story also serves as a reminder of the ongoing need for vigilance. Every generation faces new workplace hazards, new materials and processes whose long-term effects are not fully understood. The challenge is to learn from the past, to remember that assurances of safety from those who profit from a product are not sufficient, that workers deserve protection even when, especially when, that protection might reduce corporate profits. The Radium Girls thought they were working with a miracle substance, with the essence of modernity and progress. They were told repeatedly that radium was safe, that they were lucky to work with such a valuable material. They believed these assurances because they came from scientists, from authority figures, from successful businessmen. Why wouldn't they believe? The betrayal wasn't just that they were poisoned. The betrayal was that they were knowingly poisoned while being told they were safe. The betrayal was that when they became sick, they were dismissed, denied, blamed for their own suffering. The betrayal was that the company used its legal and financial resources to avoid accountability, to delay justice until many of the victims had died. This is not just a historical story. Similar patterns of corporate behavior, of prioritizing profit over health, of denying known hazards, continue in various industries today. The specific substance changes, the specific industry changes, but the fundamental dynamic remains. Workers exposed to hazards while assurances of safety are given, followed by denial and legal maneuvering when the health consequences emerge. The Radium Girls' willingness to fight, even as they were dying, set a precedent that protects workers today. Their courage in the face of corporate power showed that ordinary people could challenge injustice and win, even when the odds seemed impossible. Consider the mathematics of their suffering. Grace Fryer touched a radium-laced brush to her lips perhaps 200 times per day, for 6 days per week, for 5 years. That's approximately 312,000 exposures. Each time a tiny amount of radium entered her body. Individually, each exposure was negligible. Cumulatively, they were lethal. This is the insidious nature of many occupational hazards. The single exposure doesn't hurt you, so it's easy to dismiss the risk. But exposure after exposure, day after day, year after year, the damage accumulates until it becomes irreversible. The Radium Girls couldn't see or feel the damage being done. Radium is tasteless, odorless. The radiation it emits penetrates tissue without sensation. The early stages of poisoning produced no symptoms. By the time symptoms appeared, years after exposure began, the damage was catastrophic and irreversible. This time lag between exposure and illness is another challenge in occupational health. When someone becomes sick years after leaving a job, how do you prove the connection? How do you hold employers accountable for damage that manifests long after the employment relationship has ended? The Radium Girls cases helped establish legal principles for dealing with these latency periods. The statute of limitations for filing suit was determined to begin not when exposure occurred, but when the injury was discovered or should reasonably have been discovered. This discovery rule remains an important protection for workers exposed to hazards with long latency periods. The stories of individual Radium Girls deserve to be told in detail, because each represents not just a case study, but a person, a life with its own value and meaning. Molly Maggia was born in 1897, the daughter of Italian immigrants. She was described as beautiful, vivacious, popular with her coworkers. She loved to dance. She painted dials with exceptional skill and speed, earning top wages. When her teeth began to trouble her, she assumed it was just dental problems, nothing serious. By the time she understood what was really wrong, it was too late. She died in agony, her jaw literally disintegrating, unable to eat, in constant pain. She was 24 years old. Her death should have been a warning, but the company suppressed information about it, claimed she'd died of syphilis, protected their reputation at the cost of other workers' lives. Quinta MacDonald was a bride when she started at US Radium, newly married and excited about building a life with her husband. She worked as a dial painter to save money for a house. Within a few years, she was dying. Her husband cared for her as she deteriorated, watched helplessly as her bones broke, as her body failed. She lived long enough to join the lawsuit, to see the settlement agreed to, but died shortly after. She was in her 20s. Edna Hussman was described as the most athletic of the group, someone who loved outdoor activities and sports. Radium destroyed her bones, making movement agonizing, confining her to bed and wheelchair. The independence and physical freedom she'd valued were stolen by a substance she'd been told was safe. These women had dreams, plans, futures they expected to live. They were not looking for martyrdom or legal fame. They just wanted to work, to support themselves and their families, to live normal lives. The fact that their suffering led to important legal and scientific advances does not compensate for what was taken from them. The photographs of the Radium Girls are particularly haunting. Early photos show young women, teenagers mostly, smiling and confident. dressed in the fashions of the 1910s and 20s. Later photos taken during the trials show the same women transformed by illness, faces collapsed by lost teeth and destroyed jaws, bodies bent and broken by fractured spines, eyes that have seen too much suffering. One photograph that became iconic shows Catherine Schaub, Grace Fryer, and Edna Hussman together, taken shortly before a court appearance. Catherine has a scarf covering the lower half of her face, hiding where her jaw had been removed. Grace and Edna stand close to her, one on each side, literally holding her up. All three are dressed carefully, wearing hats and coats despite their illnesses, presenting themselves with as much dignity as they can muster. The photograph is both heartbreaking and inspiring. Dying women, refusing to be invisible, demanding to be seen and heard and believed. The legal battle attracted some unlikely allies. Labor unions, which had previously shown limited interest in the problems of female workers, began to support the Radium Girls case. Consumer advocacy groups, concerned about the broader implications of radium in commercial products, joined the fight. Even some prominent socialites and wealthy women, perhaps seeing themselves in these young workers, offered support and publicity. The case became a cause célèbre, covered extensively in newspapers and magazines. This publicity was crucial. Without public pressure, the legal system might not have been sympathetic to a few working-class women suing a powerful corporation. But the court of public opinion had already ruled in the Radium Girls' favor, and that influenced the formal legal proceedings. The role of Dr. Harrison Martland deserves particular recognition. He was a medical examiner, a scientist, not an activist or crusader. But when he examined Molly Maggia's body and realized what had happened to her, he felt a moral obligation to expose the truth. He could have simply filed his report and moved on. Instead, he conducted extensive research, developed new testing methods, and became a key witness for the Radium Girls. Martland's testimony was crucial because he was credible and disinterested. He had no financial stake in the outcome. He was a respected medical professional with impressive credentials. When he stated definitively that the dial painters were suffering from radium poisoning caused by their work, it was difficult for the company to dismiss him as biased or unqualified. His work also revealed something deeply disturbing. The company's own scientists had known about radium hazards. They'd published papers about radiation risks. They'd implemented safety protocols in their laboratories, but they hadn't extended those protections to the dial painters. And they'd actively assured the workers that radium was safe. This wasn't ignorance. This was knowing endangerment. The company understood the risks and chose to expose workers anyway, calculating that the women were expendable, that the profits from dial painting contracts justified the human cost. This is perhaps the most damning aspect of the story. If the company had simply been ignorant of radium's dangers, their actions, while still harmful, would be more understandable. But they knew. Scientists in their employ knew. Management knew. And they chose profit over human life. The ripple effects of the Radium Girls cases extended far beyond labor law. The publicity around the trials made the public aware of radiation hazards in consumer products. Radium-laced health tonics, which had been popular for decades, suddenly seemed dangerous rather than beneficial. Sales plummeted. Companies that had built entire business models around radium products saw demand evaporate. The Food and Drug Administration, which at that time had limited regulatory authority, began to take a harder look at radioactive consumer products. While they didn't immediately ban such products, that would take several more decades, they began to require warnings and to restrict radium content in various items. The cases also influenced industrial practices beyond just dial painting. Other industries that used radioactive materials began to implement safety protocols. Not always willingly, not always adequately, but the Radium Girls had demonstrated that ignoring worker safety could result in expensive lawsuits and devastating publicity. In a darkly ironic twist, the U.S. Radium Corporation itself eventually implemented safety measures for dial painters. After the lawsuits, new workers were provided with protective equipment, told not to lip point brushes, given regular medical examinations. The company finally did what they could and should have done from the beginning. But this makes their earlier behavior even more inexcusable. If they could implement safety measures after the lawsuits, they could have implemented them before. The only difference was that now they'd been forced to by legal and public pressure. Before, when it was just a matter of worker welfare versus profit, they'd chosen profit. The broader scientific legacy of the Radium Girls extends into the nuclear age. When the United States began developing atomic weapons during World War II, scientists working on the Manhattan Project were acutely aware of radiation hazards. They'd learned from the Radium Girls cases. Safety protocols for handling radioactive materials were built in part on knowledge gained from studying the dial painters' suffering. Similarly, when commercial nuclear power was developed in the 1950s and 60s, radiation safety was a central concern from the beginning. Workers at nuclear facilities were, and are, monitored constantly for radiation exposure. Strict limits are enforced. Safety equipment is mandatory. These protections exist partly because of the Radium Girls, because their cases demonstrated what happens when radiation exposure is ignored. In this sense, the Radium Girls contributed to scientific progress, but at an appalling cost. Their bodies became unintended experiments, demonstrating the effects of internal radiation exposure. Knowledge was gained, but in the most tragic way possible. This raises uncomfortable ethical questions about scientific progress and human cost. The knowledge gained from the Radium Girls has undoubtedly saved countless lives, has protected workers and civilians from radiation exposure that might otherwise have occurred. But those benefits don't justify what happened to the dial painters. They deserve protection, not posthumous recognition as unfortunate but useful case studies. The story also illuminates the gendered nature of industrial exploitation. The dial painters were almost exclusively young women, and this was not accidental. The work required fine motor skills, attention to detail, and patience, qualities that were stereotyped as feminine. More importantly, young women could be paid less than men, could be more easily controlled and supervised, and were less likely to organize or complain. The company also relied on gendered assumptions about beauty and vanity. Women would naturally want to make themselves glow, would paint radium on their nails and teeth for cosmetic purposes. This was presented as charming, feminine frivolity, rather than as evidence that the women were being systematically exposed to a toxic substance. When the dial painters became sick, gendered assumptions worked against them again. Doctors suggested they had syphilis, a diagnosis that blamed the women for their own illness and suggested moral failure. The implication was that these young women had been sexually promiscuous, had brought their suffering on themselves through immoral behavior. This was not just medically wrong, it was a deliberate strategy to discredit the women and protect the company. If the women could be portrayed as immoral, their testimonies would be less credible, their lawsuits less sympathetic. Grace Fryer and the other plaintiffs had to defend not just their health claims, but their moral character. They had to prove they were good girls, respectable, virtuous, deserving of sympathy and justice. This added another layer of humiliation to their suffering. The intersections of class, gender, and corporate power in this story are striking. These were working-class women without financial resources or social connections. They were taking on a corporation with significant resources and political influence. The legal system was not designed to favor people like them. That they won at all is remarkable. That they won while dying, while being smeared and dismissed and delayed, is extraordinary. Their victory was not inevitable. It required tremendous courage, persistence, and willingness to endure further suffering in pursuit of justice. The Radium Girls had allies, people who helped them when they might have been ignored. Raymond Berry, the lawyer who finally agreed to represent Grace Fryer and her co-workers, took significant professional risks. The case was expensive to prosecute, the outcome uncertain, and Berry worked largely without payment, subsidizing the case from his own limited resources. Dr. Martland devoted considerable time and effort to research that helped the Radium Girls, but brought him no financial benefit. He testified repeatedly, subjecting himself to harsh cross-examination, because he believed it was the right thing to do. Journalists who covered the story, who kept it in the public eye despite pressure from the company and its allies, played a crucial role. Without media coverage, the legal battle might have proceeded in obscurity, and public pressure might never have materialized. These allies were important, but they shouldn't overshadow the central role of the Radium Girls themselves. They were not passive victims. They were active agents in their own fight for justice. They made strategic decisions about how to prosecute their cases. They testified despite pain and humiliation. They refused to accept the company's settlement offers when those offers were inadequate. They persisted when many people would have given up. Grace Fryer, in particular, demonstrated remarkable strategic thinking. She understood that her case was stronger if she could find other women with similar symptoms, so she recruited co-workers to join the lawsuit. She understood the importance of public opinion, so she cooperated with journalists and photographers. She understood that delay worked in the company's favor, so she pushed her lawyer to move the case forward as quickly as possible. These were sophisticated legal and public relations strategies, coming from a young woman with no legal training who was seriously ill and in constant pain. Grace Fryer was not just a victim. She was a brilliant, determined advocate who outmaneuvered a powerful corporation. The final years of the Radium Girls' lives were marked by both suffering and advocacy. Even as they were dying, they continued to speak out, to warn other workers, to push for regulatory changes. Grace Fryer gave interviews until shortly before her death, talking about her experiences and encouraging other workers to be cautious about workplace hazards. Catherine Wolfe Donahue, the Illinois dial painter, spent her final years bedridden but continued to prosecute her case, continued to speak with journalists, continued to warn others. When she was too weak to speak clearly, she communicated through written notes. When she was too weak to write, she had others write for her. This determination in the face of death is difficult to comprehend. Most people in such circumstances would focus inward, on their own comfort and on time with loved ones. The Radium Girls did that too, but they also remained focused on justice, on accountability, on protecting future workers. Their example inspired other occupational health campaigns. Workers exposed to asbestos, to coal dust, to various industrial chemicals would later follow the path the Radium Girls had blazed. The legal precedents held. The principle that corporations could be held liable for workplace hazards became established law. Today, over a century after the Radium Girls first began painting dials, we can see their influence throughout the landscape of worker protection. The Occupational Safety and Health Administration, OSHA, created in 1970, exists partly because of cases like theirs. The requirement that employers maintain safe workplaces, that they warn workers about hazards, that they provide protective equipment, these all stem from legal principles established in the Radium Girls cases. Workers' compensation systems, which provide benefits for occupational injuries without requiring proof of employer negligence, were strengthened and expanded partly in response to cases like the Radium Girls, where proving negligence was possible but difficult. The right to know laws, which require employers to inform workers about hazardous materials in the workplace, exists because of the Radium Girls and others like them who were poisoned while being assured of safety. Every worker who benefits from these protections, who works in a safer environment because regulations require it, who can seek compensation for occupational injury, owes a debt to the Radium Girls. Most will never know their names, will never hear their stories, but the protections these workers enjoy exist because young women a century ago refused to die quietly, refused to accept that their suffering was simply the cost of doing business. The story of the Radium Girls is ultimately a story about dignity and resistance. It's about young women who were treated as expendable, as less important than corporate profits, who refused to accept that valuation. It's about people with limited resources and limited power, who nevertheless found ways to fight back, to demand accountability, to insist that their lives had value. In their suffering and their resistance, the Radium Girls embodied a fundamental truth about social change. It often comes from the margins, from those most harmed by existing systems, who have the most to lose by remaining silent and the most to gain by speaking out. They were not saints or heroes in the conventional sense. They were ordinary people placed in extraordinary circumstances who found within themselves the courage to fight. They made mistakes, had moments of doubt, sometimes wanted to give up, but they persisted. Grace Fryer, in one of her final interviews, was asked if she regretted the fight, if it had been worth the stress and pain of the legal battle. She said she had no regrets, that even if the settlement couldn't save her life, she'd accomplished something important. Future workers would be safer. Companies would be more careful. The law would protect workers better. Something good came from something terrible, she said. That has to count for something. It did count. It does count. The Radium Girls transformed American labor law, advanced scientific understanding of radiation, and demonstrated that ordinary people can challenge powerful institutions and win. Their bones still glow in the dark, will glow for centuries to come. It's a terrible poetry, a permanent reminder of corporate negligence and its consequences. But their legacy glows too, a different kind of light, illuminating the path toward justice, toward worker safety, toward a world where profits are not valued more than human lives. The young women who painted watch dials in the 1910s and 20s could not have imagined that their fight would resonate for generations, that they would become symbols of worker rights and corporate accountability. They just wanted to live, to work, to be treated fairly. In fighting for those basic human rights, they changed the world. We remember them not just for their suffering, which was immense, but for their courage, their persistence, their refusal to be invisible or silenced. We remember them because their fight is never finished. Every generation faces new workplace hazards, new corporate calculations that trade human health for profit, new battles for worker safety and dignity. The Radium Girls showed us how to fight those battles. They showed us that change is possible, that justice can prevail, that ordinary people have extraordinary power when they stand together and refuse to accept injustice. In the darkness of a bedroom in 1922, Grace Fryer's jaw glowed with radium, and she saw her own death written in that ghostly light. But she also saw something else, a choice between accepting that death silently or fighting to make it mean something, to transform personal tragedy into social change. She chose to fight. They all chose to fight. And because they did, workers today are safer, corporations are more accountable, and the law recognizes that every worker's life has value, that safety is not optional, that justice is not just for the wealthy and powerful. The radium that killed them still glows, but so does their legacy, a light that will never fade, a reminder that ordinary people can do extraordinary things, that courage and persistence can overcome even the most unequal odds, that justice, though delayed, can ultimately prevail. The Radium Girls painted light onto watch dials so that soldiers could see in the darkness. In their suffering and their fight, they became a different kind of light, illuminating injustice, showing the path toward worker safety and corporate accountability, lighting the way for generations of workers who would follow. They deserved better than what happened to them, but they ensured that future workers would have better protection, better rights, better hope for justice. In the end, perhaps that's the best monument to their memory, not just remembering what was done to them, but continuing their fight, remaining vigilant against workplace hazards, holding corporations accountable, insisting that every worker's life has infinite value. The Radium Girls glowed in the dark. Their legacy glows still, a light that will never be extinguished, a reminder of both the worst of human greed and the best of human courage. A story that must be told and retold so that we never forget the price of progress, the cost of negligence, and the power of ordinary people to change the world.